My name is John Robertson. I work for JISC, the Centre for Educational Technology and Interoperability Standards, and I'm based at the University of Strathclyde. I'd like to today raise a few questions about the role that academic libraries might have in relation to open educational resources. Before that, a little bit of context. So CDIS is one of 3 innovation support centres funded by JISC that support higher education in the UK to engage in standards communities, provide community forums for discussing the use of technologies and standards, and provide support to specific JISC development projects. So that's my context. Most recently I've been supporting the UK OER programmes. HEFGI through JISC and the Higher Education Academy in the UK have in the past 2 years put £10 million into development programmes in open educational resources to promote sustainable reuse and sharing and explore what models might work. In the context of this conference, I know that a lot of us are interested in open education. I'm mostly today talking about open educational resources. The 2 things are different, they're both important, but sharing open educational resources and doing open education are 2 very different questions. As a premise, I'm going to say that institutions play a vital role in both, particularly in releasing and sustaining open educational resources. And there's lots of arguments around that, but if nothing else, they provide somewhere for us to work. I think one of the key challenges for sustainability is if you want to do open education, who's going to pay your salary? And I think for many people, it's going to be an institution. So that's kind of all on the side, but I want to say that because I'm aware that there's different perspectives on those issues. And this is where I'm starting from. So here in this strand, talking about embedding, sustaining and scaling. Project funding is nice, but it doesn't last. So what do? How do we make what we're doing part of what we're doing anyway? How can we be efficient? And who in our organisations does this sort of thing, or outside of our organisations, does this sort of thing anyway? One answer is to consider open educational practices, and I'll direct you to the work of the Open Project. It's the European project that I think you should all go and have a look at, particularly the work of Bronya Knoll at Open University. I think they're asking some very interesting questions, but that's about open education, so we're going to put that to the side. Another question that could be asked is what's the possible role of libraries and librarians or other groups? But primarily I'm talking about libraries and librarians. You might ask, why on earth am I asking that question? Well, we frequently talk about the open source community as a model for open education and OER release. But the open source community is also part of a spectrum of, if you like, open innovation. And another part of that is open access. That's another possible community model that we might look at and consider its relevancy. And there are perhaps, arguably, some closer links between open access and OERs and open source software and OERs, particularly because both open access and OERs are in some form dealing with institutions, dealing with academics. Open source software development is a slightly different model. Now, yeah, there are lots of massive questions about how valid, how usable these models are for OER release, for OER sustainability, for open education, but we're just going to politely put those to the side. In the context of my work supporting UK OER, I was left asking the question, we've got this massive investment in institutions in open access, and the library plays frequently a critical role in that. What about in OERs? So, in open access, libraries are highly involved in advocacy. They're highly involved in establishing permissions and managing the IPR involved in managing and releasing open access copies of papers. They frequently run and support the software required and, in many cases, develop it, but not exclusively, obviously. They provide services to faculty and students to support open access, to add value, your profile of your recent presentations for an individual academic, recent papers on your university website. These are things that the library, in some cases, often does. And increasingly, particularly in the UK with the Research Excellence Framework, but in other countries as well, the library and managing the repository and the open access is being tied into institutional research management. And the visibility of materials in open access repositories may contribute to raising the research profile of an institution, certainly its online visibility. So, libraries are pretty important. Academic libraries are pretty important in open access. Are there any relevant skills to managing, releasing, and using open educational resources? Some of these might be some expertise and interest in metadata, and more generally in good resource description. Skills in information management and resource dissemination. One that's missing off this list, I don't know why, but preservation. Libraries traditionally have an interest in preserving stuff and providing ongoing access. Also, digital or information literacy. How are we supporting students to find and evaluate and use OERs? Does that have anything to do with the information literacy that libraries traditionally provide? Could libraries create subject-based guides to finding resources? Yes, no, maybe would that scale? But it's an idea, it's a possible connection. And also coming back to the managing of IPR and promoting appropriate open licensing. Libraries do have some relevant skills in the area. So I think there is a possibility for embedding and for making things more sustainable by involving libraries. To use one specific example, if we consider digital literacy, if we think about the questions what students need to know to find and use open educational resources, they need to know to find things, evaluate things, they need to understand what they're actually looking for, and they need to know how to engage with it and use it in a way that will help them. So some of those questions actually fit directly with traditional information literacy and the types of things that types of courses that libraries frequently provide to students anyway. And it might be easy enough to include open educational resources as part of that ongoing provision that happens in the institution anyway, and that will be sustainable. But I think it's clear to point out that the skills and knowledge needed to answer those questions can't just be provided by a library. It fits in with the provision of study skills, it fits in with the academic support units, it fits in with the units supporting academic writing. So there's a great opportunity for libraries and for OER, not just for libraries to be involved in supporting the release of OERs, but there's also an opportunity to build closer links with other academic units on campus, and together to be able to provide a more sustainable service and to provide a better quality of service for students, with all the things that follow from that. There are, however, some questions and pitfalls. Not speaking of any libraries in particular, but libraries can be slow to adapt and support new services or to modify existing services. That's a fact. Perhaps it's something to do with the librarian's personality, perhaps not. Perhaps it's just an organisational, I'll pay for that. Perhaps it's just an organisational ethos. But more importantly, open educational resources are often ephemeral, and they require a much lighter touch and different forms and more ready access than traditional research materials. And one of the things, there have been many projects to learn materials that involve libraries in the past that have been wonderfully successful, but there have also been projects where the library has catalogued the project to death. Because if you ask, how do you describe something? Well, you use the LOM. It's like, okay, how many fields do we need to use? Well, this person thinks this one, this person thinks this one, this person thinks this one. And all of a sudden, for every learning material, every learning OER that you've got, you're wanting to provide the 70 odd fields, and it doesn't work. It's never going to work. And we don't actually know if they're used or which of them are used. And apart from that, managing OERs, managing academics and trying to coordinate the release of open educational resources on an institutional level is probably like herding cats. Can you persuade the library that it's a good use of their time and effort? Can they afford it in the budgetary situation that they frequently face? New skills are required. Educational resources are not research materials. Educational description is not the same, the sort of thing. And the fair use to use material in your class is one thing, fair use to publish it is something else. And apart from that, OERs require a degree of risk management. There's no way around it. Releasing OERs is probably going to be risky. Not just risk avoidance, risk management. And libraries and institutions are traditionally risk averse, so that's another case that would have to be made. Okay, so that's my proposal. That's what I think is worth talking about, worth considering, worth investigating. So I carried out a very quick survey of some institutional, some OER projects and libraries, and I'm very quickly going to show you some of the results from that. It's not conclusive, it's very much a dipping a toe in the water, but worth having a look at. Sent the survey out, got I think it was 36 complete responses from OER initiatives and projects around the world, which was great. One thing that was interesting, and this statistic increased as the length of time the survey was out there also increased, was that I had something like 48 incomplete surveys. 48 people started looking at the survey and said, no, I don't want to do this. Now, some of that might be with survey design, some of that might be with if it got to libraries rather than to OER initiatives. I'm not sure how much sense the survey would make. So there's another question there. There's also the last question caused some confusion, but that's only an issue if you want to look at the survey. So 36 responses by country, dominant response from the United Kingdom and from the United States, but quite actually represent lots of people showing up from all over the world, which I was quite encouraged by. About a third of the responses from outside of UK and US. Organisation type, can't quite see all of that, but essentially university, library and educational initiative, which was a way of grouping multiple university things, ended up being about 31 projects. So predominantly it was people involved in institutions who were responding to the survey. Some interesting responses from companies and publishers promoting open educational resources and open educational textbooks. Separate question. About 52% of the respondents were librarians based in libraries. There were no librarians not based in libraries, and no people who weren't librarians who were based in libraries working in this area. That's actually interesting, but that's a question for another day. So, how involved is your library in the release of open educational resources? Thinking about the release question, nice kind of spread there actually. It's encouraging that there's quite a few projects involved, where there are 12 projects where the library is a partner or leading the OER release initiative. Whenever we look at the question of the use of OERs though, the same question, we're talking about use rather than release, the picture's much less happy. There's some awareness of it, but there are far fewer libraries involved in supporting the use of OERs. Now, if we come back to the digital literacy example, I think for students, that's a problem. However, whenever we consider individual librarians rather than libraries, there's a higher number of individual librarians who are actively engaging with the use of OERs, so I find that encouraging. The last question had all sorts of interesting parameters about what's your project doing, what might the library do, and what could the library do, but getting people to fill out 3 columns at once proved to be a mistake. So this is just the data from the last column. What is your library actually doing? And we identified that list of possible ways the library could be involved. The one that stands out is the library, or not the library could be involved, their library was involved. The one that stands out is the provision of IPR guidance. And actually, despite the previous results, there's also a lot of support in the bottom half of the graph for the use and discovery of open educational resources. Now, this is out of 36 respondents, so what you'll note is that there aren't any very high numbers. And what was interesting about the survey results, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is that projects were picking out 1 or 2 of these, and that was it. So there's clearly quite a spread of actual library involvement in different areas. So there is potential for more across different areas. So where are we with this? Well, I think the involvement of libraries is very much in its infancy. I think there's more involvement in release rather than use. There is clearly, though, a spectrum of activity types being carried out. The link is there. I'm presuming this presentation will be up somewhere at some point. I certainly got it on SlideShare, but it'll be elsewhere. But that's the data. I've only had a chance to do a preliminary look at this, but anyone is more than welcome to take the data and have a closer look. One thing I knew, because I knew some of the people responding to this, so 8 respondents from UK OER, 4 from kind of cross-institutional initiatives, 4 from institutional initiatives, and they would divide 50-50 on whether the library is involved. All the institutional projects who responded, the library was involved. All the cross-institutional projects that responded, the library wasn't involved. I think that says a lot about the type of people who were involved in the projects. There were also some very positive comments about the survey, but also that there's a need to consider other organisations apart from libraries. Okay, what's next? I'm hoping to follow up on expressions of interest in the work. We're thinking through with others a wider follow-up survey of librarians, targeting the library community rather than the open education community, trying to identify more closely the challenges and opportunities afforded by library involvement, identify possible collaborations, and in my day job, continue to support UK OER Phase 2. Thank you.
In the 4 or I guess maybe 12 libraries that were involved, did you get a feel for what they were doing? The answer is.
So, I'm afraid I'm not.
Of the 4 that said they were involved.
Oh, sorry.
Did you know how it broke down to this?
No, that's the kind of further analysis I haven't done. From what I know of the projects, some of them were involved in determining metadata profiles, and cataloging of the OERs. Some of them were involved in the rights clearance. There seemed to be very, I think the digital literacy is what's not happening. Does that answer? I think there's certainly an issue of staff development and open content literacy for staff, which is crucial. I'm kind of assuming that is something the library could be involved in, but that's something that any open education initiative will be tackling anyway, because it's got to do that. I think the issue for students has to do with how to incorporate OERs. I mean, it's how to incorporate any content that you've discovered. But I think the challenge with OERs is perhaps that suddenly there's potentially this vast range of other types of stuff. I think a lot of OERs are released and designed for use by lecturers. So if you're a student, how do you interact with that material? So yes, there's the type of discovery, evaluation of the quality of a resource. Thinking about its use, thinking about if you're a student and you're not getting what your lecturer is saying, if you want to go out and find a resource from another university, are there any issues there about education, about the educational side of using that, finding it and evaluating and using it, that we need to be supporting students with? That's not necessarily specific to open content, but in terms of what they're going to be able to find, potentially there's going to be more open content.
Are you saying that libraries in their information literacy training have
I think libraries do provide training for academic staff. I think, though, that some of the issues in training for academic staff they're understood, so they could be embedded in a library, or they could be provided by the wider Open OER initiative. So I think I think any OER initiative has to educate staff. It's not something that's optional. The library might be involved in that, the library might not be involved in that. I think it depends how the OER initiative is set up within the institution. I think in terms of students, I think you could support students in using OERs even if you weren't releasing OERs as an institution. I think that's where it becomes a bigger question. I'm not sure if I've answered that, but we can come back to it. I mean, I think it's certainly an area of possible involvement. But I think perhaps the student question, the reason I highlighted that is that that's one that it's been less considered.